The next lecture comes from a very good man from Syria. So after this lecture, we get a lecture from Syria, Kevork Almassian. He is political commentator and blogger, and very glad.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to speak in front of you. Actually, I come from Syria. My grandparents survived the Armenian genocide and they moved in Syria. Apparently, they loved the food in Aleppo, so we stayed there and they didn't migrate to somewhere else. And in 2011, the war erupted in Syria, and I followed the war in Syria quite extensively and closely, and I was documenting what's happening on the ground and the role of the NATO countries in let's say, spreading the chaos in the country, which led, I would say, to the 90% of the Armenians now are migrated again from Syria to the rest of the world because of this NATO war. NATO-led, let's say, regime change war. In any case, in 2014, I was in Lebanon. I was working as a journalist, producer, and an anchor in a TV channel. And back then, my direct manager was a professor of international relations and expert on geopolitics. His name is Dr. Jamal Wakim. And when the Biden-Obama administration engineered a coup d'etat in Kiev, he told me, if World War III is about to happen, it's going to start in Ukraine. And I was surprised back then by his statement, but I wanted to dig in and understand the core of the issue in Ukraine, because my field of expertise, I was doing master in Middle Eastern studies in Beirut, so I wanted also to dig in the Ukraine conflict and read a little bit about geopolitical theories, but also to go to Ukraine and also met with Dragana in the Donbas region to see what is happening there on the ground, because both sides, in my opinion, wage information warfare. I mean, the Russian side and the American side, right? But you have to be there to see. And in my opinion, the scene there, the neo-Nazi scene, is not an exaggeration in Ukraine. And if I want to summarize the struggle over Ukraine in one word, it's going to be Eurasia. The Eurasian project was first elaborated by the Brits, and the Americans adopted the ideals of the project after emerging as a superpower in the aftermath of World War II. Now, in order to establish and keep its hegemonic status over Eurasia, the priority of the United States has been, and still is, to block any sort of unity or political and economic integration of the Eurasian mainland under the leadership of one power. Hence, the American focus was on blocking the aspirations of Russia or China to become a leading power in Eurasia. However, by observing the development in the current war in Ukraine, it seems Russia and China came to the conclusion that they cannot end America's hegemony over Eurasia individually. That's why we are witnessing rapid integration of Russian and Chinese political and economic efforts, and probably military integration in the future in order to end US's supremacy over Eurasia. Now, in the geopolitical mindset of the United States, if a unity is established in the Eurasian mainland under the leadership of Moscow or Beijing or both countries together, it will first isolate the United Kingdom and then the United States from their eastern hemisphere. The US geopolitical understanding was elaborated by the American geopolitical theorist Nikolai Spikman, whose ideas were inspired, surprisingly, by the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries. And the Mongol Empire conquered most of the Eurasian mainland, which stretched between Far East Asia and all the way to Anatolia, and then finally to Hungary and Poland. Now, with the supremacy of the Mongolian Empire on Eurasia, Western civilization came under direct threat. And since then, Western decision makers are trying to avoid a Mongolian-style unity in the Eurasian mainland that may threaten the West in particular. And nowadays we can see these attempts of Eurasian unity outside of the US umbrella stands on 3 pillars. And these 3 pillars are Russia, China, and Iran. One of the steps toward a Eurasian unity is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which started in 1996, and it covers around 60% of the Eurasian mainland. And with Iran's full membership process, which started in 2021 under the leadership of President Raisi, to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the 3 pillars of Eurasia have been completed. Now, let's talk about a little bit about NATO, which was formed after World War II as a military alliance that aims at defeating the Soviet Union and forcing it to retreat from East Germany and Eastern Europe. After the collapse of the USSR, against the promise, of course, of James Baker to Gorbachev, who said that NATO will not expand 1 inch to the east of Berlin, NATO expanded eastward, especially in former Soviet countries, all the way to the borders with current-day Russia. The US isolation attempts against first the USSR, and then Russia didn't stop in Eastern Europe. Let's remember the United States supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in late 70s and early 80s against the Soviet Union, and this was the idea of Brzezinski, to drag the Soviet Union into a very costly war in Afghanistan, which eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and the Soviets retreated from Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan geography is very important in my opinion, because it gives Washington the perfect location to project its hegemony and its power in Kazakhstan, which is one of Russia's biggest southern neighbors. And let's remember also recently the attempt for color revolution that happened again in Kazakhstan. It lies in the same context. In addition to this, I documented a lot the US support for the radical Islamists around the world, and especially in Syria, but similar attempts happened in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, in Chechnya, in Tajikistan, and all these countries. And I also remember after the war in 1973 between Egypt, Syria against Israel, which was aimed at liberating the territories they lost in 1967 war, Anwar Sadat, back then, he chose a different path. He chose the path of diplomacy, and then Jimmy Carter jumped in and he convinced him to strike a deal with Israel. And since then, the Soviets left also Egypt, which means left the Northern Africa, and from Northern Africa, they started to project their power also on the Middle East. This package of American steps was all meant against the USSR and later Russia. Now, if you want to speak a little bit about Ukraine, which I believe is the most important geopolitical conflict in our modern times, Ukraine represents one of the 4 bridges that include France, Germany, and Poland. And this bridge gives the United States an access to the heart of the world. On the other hand, Russia without Ukraine becomes a regional power, a regional Asian power, and loses its European dimension. And this was explained again by Brzezinski. That's why Ukraine joining the NATO, or even becoming a de facto NATO state without joining formally NATO, which has happened under Zelensky, unfortunately, is a red line for Russia, because Ukraine will become the starting base to project US's power into the heart of the world, which means also into Russia. Russia also believes that if Ukraine becomes NATO or client state for the United States, the latter can project its power inside Russia and trigger internal conflicts and seek the Balkanization of the Russian Federation. Based on this geopolitical context, in my understanding, that this is why the United States engineered the coup in the first place in Kiev in 2014 and supported the neo-Nazi battalions in Ukraine. And it had 3 main goals. 1, to control Ukraine and get an access to the heart of the world. 2, to block Russia's access to the Black Sea, the Black Sea is very important for Russia. During the era of the Cold War, there was a theory of the sea power and the land power, and the Soviet Union was mostly a land power, and the American and its allies were mostly a sea power. And now the Russians believe that they need to have more access to the international waters. And for them, being blocked from the Black Sea is the same thing as being taken away from the Mediterranean. And that's why they, after the coup, the first thing the Russians did is to the referendum in Crimea, because it was very important for them to have a fleet in the Black Sea, and from the Black Sea they can also access the Mediterranean. And when the Russians came to Syria in 2015, the first thing they did is to build a fleet on the Mediterranean, because they want to have also water on the war waters. The third goal is to draw, the Americans want to draw a line in Ukraine. This is the place where they want to slice between Russia and the rest of Europe. Why? Because they want to block further economic integration of Russian and German economies, because again, in Brzezinski's thoughts, nothing threatens the American hegemony over Eurasia and eventually over the world than a Russian-German integration. So in conclusion, I believe if Russia with its energy resources and manpower come together with Germany's technology and industry, it will represent a huge challenge to the US, as the region will develop and be self-sufficient. And hence there will be no need, especially in terms of economy and security, hence there will be no need for NATO's protection of Germany. And this is something the US cannot tolerate. That's why Biden ordered, in my opinion, also the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline. And this was also explained by the veteran investigative journalist Seymour Hersh recently. Now, I just want to end up this with few comments, because I follow the German press quite extensively. What was the reaction of the German press to the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline? First, they blamed Russia, and then there was a phase of silence, and then when Seymour Hersh came and revealed with his intelligence information the role of Biden administration in bombing the pipelines, they started planting false information in the press. And now they say a pro-Ukrainian group conducted this operation. In my opinion, the pro-Ukrainian group is the CIA, of course. I mean, who has an access to the Baltic Sea and who has the technological means and the military means to conduct such an operation? It's definitely not a non-state actor. It's a state actor who conducted this operation. So it really, I feel a pain in my chest, because I'm not German, but I live in Germany. I love Germany, and I am very happy to live in Germany, and I appreciate, because Germany has given me a second chance after the war to come into country, to work, to learn the language, and to give something to this country. And it hurts me to see the Stockholm syndrome that spreads in among the elites and among the, especially the press, that they are hostage of the American mentality, let's say. Now we have few diplomatic activities happening in the region. The Chinese are presenting themselves as an alternative for the Americans to strike deals between former foes, like the Saudi Arabia and Iran. They came together. This is a very big deal. The Iranians and the Saudis and the Syrians are coming together thanks to Russia. And so, what's the role of the United States? China is proposing a diplomatic solution for Ukraine. The Americans refuse it. Okay, you consider China as a non-neutral, non-objective power. Where is your diplomatic initiative in Ukraine? It seems to me the Americans have chosen to go further in this war, and they're taking the entire European continent with them to this conflict in Ukraine. And the recent statements of the American officials, the Secretary of the State and the spokesperson for the National Security Council, John Kirby, they all refused the Chinese proposal. And in the contrary, now we see the UK is sending depleted uranium to Ukraine. And I just want to remind everyone that in Iraq, up until this moment, after 2 decades, children are being born with birth defects. And we're not only talking about now birth defects, but Ukraine, where this weapon will be used, it consists of 10% of the global wheat production. So you're going to poison probably 10% of the food basket of the world. So this is also, in my opinion, not only about geopolitics, but also food warfare. And we see similar warfare is being waged after the corona, if we want to call it a pandemic, we can call it whatever we want, but we can see what's happening now in the Netherlands against the farmers. So there is this element of also warfare against the food basket of the world. And I experienced this firsthand in Syria. I just want to give this example, I finish it. So on the eastern shore of the Euphrates, Syria has most of its wheat. And it has one of the best wheat in the world because the soil is very rich. And Syria developed a genetic codes for the wheats that are very resistant against the bugs. And the Americans, they had a problem with their wheat production in the United States. So when the NATO-backed so-called rebels occupied the suburbs of Aleppo, this institution which developed the genetic codes, it was taken over by these rebels. And what these rebels did, they took these genetic codes to the United States. The first thing they did is they give it to the Americans, and they solved their problem. That's no problem. Okay, you want to solve it. But how the American administration tanked the Syrians, the US aid, which is another branch of the CIA, they sent a genetically modified seeds, wheat seeds, to the farmers in the eastern shore of the Euphrates in order also to poison the soil of Syria. And in Syria, genetically modified products is banned under a presidential order. And now our soil on the eastern shore of the Euphrates, which is occupied by the United States and the Kurdish militias, they are planting this genetically modified, unfortunately, wheat. And I think this is also a topic maybe we could also discuss during our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we are going to the last lecture.